Thank you very much, Bob. Do I need this? I guess you can hear me. For a very generous introduction. You remembered things about me that I didn't remember, and I appreciate it. And I appreciate the invitation from the museum to give this talk and to be part of the Shep Crack lecture series, because he certainly was one of the early papers I read that kindled my interest in human ecology and in northern peoples in general. I offered two topics. One was herring, the other was sacred mountains, and there was a unanimous decision that this should be sacred mountains. But herring is going to figure in, and just so you stay awake, there'll be a test at the end. And I've also come with one artifact, because since I agreed to give this talk when I was at Oxford, I have moved more or less back to Juneau, back into Southeast Alaska, and become the Dean of Arts and Sciences at UAS. And we held something called Indigenous Peoples Day. And interestingly, and I had already given the title of this, this image became the centerpiece of this Indigenous Peoples Day. So I'll just pass this around. And if it looks like it fits you, don't take it, because it was a gift to me. And I haven't worn it yet, because I was saving it. I'm going to wear it after I give it to you, so it's clean. But it is an image by David Boxley of the flood. The flood is there in the middle, and it's typical Northwest Coast design. There's a lot of layers and dimensions to it. But the theme of that day was resilience amid change. And so the theme of the flood is alive and well, and I did not know this when I offered this talk up, but it's proof that it is still a very meaningful set of stories to talk about in the context of resilience and adaptation. And I want to start by talking about narrative. I haven't always been a person who's looked at narrative in detail. There are other scholars among the Tlingit who do that. Nora and Richard Dowenhauer, for example, were famous for bringing Tlingit oral tradition into what they called oral literature and printing it in marvelous bilingual texts. And some of this does engage with the flood, but there's actually a lot more that I had the opportunity to uncover. But I became interested in narrative basically when we decided at Oxford, when I was directing a course called Environmental Change and Management, to do an integrative first week of that course called Welcome to the Anthropocene. And we had a series of lectures and people talking about what the Anthropocene means, and how many people are familiar with this term, right? So all know what it means. It means that humans are now the dominant force on the Earth system, and we need to take hold of that and ownership of that and respond to it. But I think when we did this in 2012 or 2013, one of my reactions was the narratives are pretty limited in this. And of course, narrative has become a big issue around how we talk about and educate people about climate change in general. And I don't know if you're familiar with this study, but this just came out. It's some research that's been done by the Climate Communication in Practice project. And it's a nice little graphic. It shows what have we learned about communicating about environmental change or about climate change. And the consensus is that we start with the values of the audience, the things that matter to them. We create methods, whether it's visual methods, poetry, storytelling, that are effective ways of engaging those values. And then we show images that are local, that are meaningful to them. Okay? And I would say that encapsulates a lot of what I want to say to you today about the way Tlingits represent their own responses to environmental change over millennia, and particularly with respect to catastrophic flooding that occurred since they settled in Southeast Alaska. But I think at the time, we had a lot to learn about how you narrate climate change and environmental change. Okay? And I'm going to give you a sort of introduction to the nuts and bolts of this project now, and then I'm not actually going to talk a lot about the results of this specific project, but more about my part in it. But this was all motivated by an opportunity to work with a couple of archaeologists, Bill Hunt and Ralph Hartley from the University of Nebraska, and a couple of lichenologists, who I never thought I'd be teamed with, who were trying to date these Alpine cairns at about 2,000 feet above some places near Sitka in southeast Alaska, to do an oral history component, because they were doing what was relatively a new thing in the Northwest Coast, which is Alpine archaeology. Everybody thought that sites are all going to be within 500 feet of the sea, and if not, they're already covered by water because of basically the rise in sea level since the last glacial maximum. And so you'd be doing underwater archaeology, and it's only recently that people have begun to look up. But they're finding things like these rock piles, cairns, and of course in the oral history, which is the part I was doing, you do find Ut'u, which Bob mentioned, sacred things, crests of clans that reference mountains where people took refuge during the flood. This one is of Takunakusha, which is called Devil's Thumb. It's behind the modern community of Wrangell. So as an introduction to this whole talk and to get the technical business out of the way, here we go. I want to show a little video that is introduced, oh, okay, it's not full screen, right? Go full screen. That is introduced by one of the people we interviewed for this project, David Katzik, who talks about the importance of cairns, and he'll do it much better than I can.
Look at all these rocks. And look at the size of these rocks that are piled on top of one another. And it's interesting that if rocks didn't have any kind of meaning, what would be the purpose? Why would anybody do this type of thing? This is material, but it also shouts the spirit of a human being's endeavor to survive. It speaks louder than all the written books.
Northern Lights, Aurora Borealis.
This tells a story. This tells a story of survival.
Baranof Island, one of the largest islands in southeast Alaska. Like neighboring islands, its nearly impenetrable steep mountains hold pockets of wet, temperate rainforest, which receive up to 8 feet of rain and 4 feet of snow each year. Baranof, in northern southeast Alaska, is the home of the Tlingit people. For thousands of years, their ancestors thrived off the bounty of the ocean, hunting seasonally further inland. But in the late 1700s, Europeans began to occupy Tlingit country, exerting political and economic control of their ancestral lands and waters. Commercial fishing, fur trading, logging, and missionary activity forced drastic changes in Tlingit heritage. Nevertheless, many Tlingits have managed to maintain major elements of their culture. Their songs and dance display the importance of tradition, passing down their culture through rich storytelling. Some of those stories are about rocks.
We have a lot of oral traditions about the flood and people going to mountaintops. And, you know, there are some specific stories about rocks and rock formations.
You see those mountains, It says on one of those mountain top, right at the top there's a rock pile.
If it wasn't for these mountains, there wouldn't be much people here.
They went to the top of that mountain where, when water was coming up, the earth was flooded. They started building rafts, and they made ropes to tie themselves to the mountain. But even the mountain went under.
Today, west wind 10 knots, 62 feet or less. Tonight, west wind 10 knots, 62 feet or less. Areas of fog with visibility 1 nautical mile or less range. Wednesday, light wind.
Okay, I'm going to skip ahead and skip the archaeology. Sorry for
long
that time.
time ago. This is why we've been here all these years. This will not overtake us. Tlingit-Demiurge. We're Tlingit people.
Sorry, I skipped ahead a little too far. Well, we'll come back to it if we can. And I'll skip. And go back to this. And away from the current slide. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of a flavor of what stimulated this project. And Pete Stegan, who was the narrator, really was assigned to follow me very late in the project. I was the oral history guy, and he was there to film the archaeology, and they got this idea that he could do some filming, and he followed me in that first interview, which you hear excerpts from David Katzik, went for 3 hours. And at the end of it, he was really just off the plane from Nebraska, and he said, "Oh my God, are they all going to be like this?" And many of them were. So this was the project study area. As I said, it's in the area just north of Sitka. And as I said, these cairns, they found more than 36 of them, all in the vicinity of Sitka, mostly at a level of about 1,500 to 2,000 feet. These are the smaller rock piles, but there are larger ones in circular form that are known as stone nests. But these are associated mainly with flood marking and possibly with communications, and are not the true flood refuges. But people's stories, the oral history behind this, emphasize the importance of mountains as flood refuges. As Mabel Jack said, these mountains saved a lot of people. And so those stories are drawn from the wider area of Tlingit country, and so I'll be jumping around in talking about some of these. But perhaps one of the best statements on the importance of these sites is by Charlie Joseph, who was an elder from Sitka, a Kagwantan elder. And he said, my grandfather, Shiaku, would tell about Angatlaku, which is the Great Flood, when the world was flooded. The white men are always telling us we moved here from somewhere else. When did we move here? Before the flood or after? These are the questions I ask. You walk around, my good son, on top of the mountains. Your people used to live in Dachet, Nakwasina. From time immemorial, your stories came from there. On the mountain, on top of there, you will see rock piles. Monuments or markers. In Tlingit, they're called khu. Some of them are 4 feet high. Moss has grown around them. Some places, the highest mountains, have them in a round circle, what they call stone nests, or te kudi. That's history. If you're Tlingit, that's proof you've lived here way before time and you were created here. Okay, so that's how the stories are viewed. And he also calls attention to the 2 types of rock formations that I want to make reference to. The one are these Alpine cairns, which you saw in the film. The other are the circular stone nests, which tend to be on higher mountains, which are the true refuges that people escaped to during the flooding that occurred most likely after the last glacial maximum and before the Little Ice Age. Okay. So important in the flood is that it is a singular event, the Great Flood, but there are flooding events that have occurred since then, and all of these are recorded. So it's a recurring environmental stress that people have encountered in Southeast Alaska. And one reason for this is, of course, the glacial melt, but you also have glacier outburst floods and other things that are occurring even to the present day in Juneau, where I live. The greatest and most ancient flood is this one at the end of the last glacial maximum, and is attributed in part to the Trickster-Demiurge Raven's mythic cycle, which made the world as Southeast Alaska natives came to know it. It is often associated with a figure called the flood caller, who seeks to drive Raven out of the world, but fails in part because Raven himself is resilient, adaptive, clever, but importantly, born of stone, literally. So humans in the Tlingit configuration follow Raven's example in responding to subsequent events of environmental and climate change in the Holocene period. So when I talk, I want to bring some of these terms, into the present day. If you're familiar with the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, then you know they have official definitions for some of the terms I'm going to use, which I think are fine as a starting point. So vulnerability, I won't talk too much about. Resilience, as they see it, is the capacity of a socio-ecological system to absorb shocks and perturbations and still sustain itself. Fundamentally in terms of structure and function. Adaptation, which is adjustment, significant adjustment of the system to social or environmental conditions. And then adaptive capacity, the ability to adjust to potential damage, to take advantage of opportunities in the context of climate change, or to respond to its consequences. But they don't stress in the IPCC reports that we need narratives to think about how to do this. And so I think narratives are important, and when we started teaching about this unit, Welcome to the Anthropocene, one of the things that me and one of my colleagues, an ecologist, Yudvinder Mali, we were reflecting on how the narratives weren't very compelling. And we ended up writing an article about this for the Anthropocene Review, where we typologized the narratives that were out there into 4 types. The first being the moral Jeremiad, which is the one that essentially makes you feel guilty and bad, and that human sin has caused this, rapaciousness, economic growth, an endless economic growth, consumption, and so on, and that now we need to make amends and get our act together, or we're doomed. The second narrative is the march of progress, where you see human domination and Anthropocene is essentially an inevitable endpoint of evolution of human beings as intelligent social creatures, and we should embrace our status and deliver the right solutions for human welfare and human progress. This leads into the third vision, which is the techno-fixed optimist position, which is maybe exemplified in the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, if you've ever read that, which is essentially saying, hey, as long as we identify these problems and get the best minds and technology and so on around them, we can engineer and think our way out of this Anthropocene and cope and reach a new stability. And then the fourth one we labeled New Genesis, which is essentially moving towards a re-enchantment with nature through closer relationships with Earth systems in what Thomas Berry termed an ecozoic age. And so of those 4, the last one is maybe the closest to the Raven narrative, but it's not, because to really embrace this Tlingit perspective on environmental change, you would have to get rid of the term Anthropocene and put in Ravencene or something like that. So we can do that perhaps just tonight. So of course the Raven is this trickster figure. It's not exclusive to Tlingit or to the Northwest Coast. You find it as far away as China and throughout much of North America. But the trickster narratives are probably most developed in the Pacific Northwest. And in these narratives, Raven is both a witness and a source of many of the great changes in the Earth system, including the Great Flood the release of the sun, the theft and redistribution of fresh water and fire, and the regularity of the tides. Raven is not a god, he's not a scientist, he's not a humanitarian, he's not an engineer or a manager, but instead he's a rogue demiurge pushing social and planetary boundaries incautiously in pursuit of his selfish short-term interests. In that respect, he's a lot like us as human beings, but his results tend to always be transformative. Raven is never satisfied with dwelling in the safe operating space. I'm poking fun at some of these notions that come out of Anthropocene writing. He refuses to be contained. Like humans of the Anthropocene, his selfish, ignoble, chaotic, and insatiable appetites have cosmic consequences and unanticipated knock-on effects to which he is forced to accommodate and ultimately adapt. So that's a narrative frame that is quite useful and quite novel in terms of we really probably can't engineer our way out of what we're doing, and we probably can't guilt our way back into living sustainably. So we're going to have to face knock-on situations, we're going to be creating novel environments that we didn't anticipate, but we have to adapt to. Now, as we look to do that, I think the lessons of long-term adaptation to environmental change in Southeast Alaska are really quite instructive. We look a lot at the Arctic to understand the impacts of climate change. That's certainly well and good, as that they face enormous impacts and they are on the front lines of climate change. But the Northwest Coast is interesting because it's just as dynamic and has been dynamic over a much longer period of time. And you have people who have been dwelling there, apparently, for about 10,000 years. Now, there's not evidence at this point of major influxes of new people over the past 10,000 years, although there are some. So we have people who have been developing in situ in a sometimes rapidly changing and profoundly changing environment over a long time. So how they did this, with what narratives and what material culture and what social organization, I think is of relevance to a larger discussion of adaptation to climate change. So to think about this, and in the spirit of defining epochs like the Anthropocene and the Holocene and the Pleistocene and so on, we can think of this period of flooding and adaptive capacity in Tlingit as following three formations. And I've roughly linked these to what are pretty much accepted as the periods of development in Northwest Coast culture. So the first one would be the epoch of what I'm calling the Epoch of Formation, and this would coincide with the early period of Northwest Coast cultural sequence development, which is from about 12,000 to about 5,000 years before present. This is a highly dynamic time. This is the end of the last ice age, essentially. Melting of glaciers, and Southeast Alaska, as I'll show you in a minute, was largely covered by glaciers. So tremendous changes in the landscape. And it's considered to be when the Earth was really formed by Raven. And so it's an important part of the development of the culture. The second epoch I call the Epoch of Reorganization, that roughly corresponds to the middle period of Northwest Coast cultural development from about 5,000 to about 1,500 years before present. And this constitutes the stabilization of the environment, relatively speaking, the development of salmon culture, and complex multi-local clan organization, as well as trade. And then finally you have the Epoch of Resilience, which would go right up to this present day, and people conceptualizing how you respond to a flood of social change that has been brought by historical colonization, technical, social, and other ecological change, including climate change. Okay, so I've got a lot of words here, in part because I thought it would be easy to read along on these things. But the Epoch of Formation has been documented by many anthropologists. This version here is one that was collected by Frederica de Laguna. I've condensed it and adapted it. But she was really, you mentioned my following in her footsteps, and we certainly do, all of us who work in Tlingit, because she was a person who combined archaeology and ethnology in very creative ways, and one of those was by paying careful attention to oral history And when people talked about these rock piles, these Alpine cairns, she didn't investigate them directly, but she did go see some of them and then ask a lot of questions. And she was of the mind that they could not be periglacial formations or other natural formations, that they were anthropogenic. And so she said they were worthy of further investigation. So yet again, I'm following Freddie. So this myth is the one where you have the flood caller, which is Raven's uncle. And he was so jealous of his beautiful wife that he killed all his sister's baby boys. Finally, Crane gave the grieving mother a hot stone to swallow, which resulted in the birth of an invulnerable son, Raven, who grew with miraculous rapidity to manhood. The uncle had in vain tried to kill him in various ways, finally by unleashing the flood. After saving his mother from the rising waters, Raven flew to the sky and suspended himself above the flood by sticking his bill into the underside of the sky, literally into the skin of the earth or the atmosphere. Finally, as the flood subsided, he fell down into some floating kelp. There was nothing but water then, no land anywhere, but he met 2 sea otters and induced them to dive for sand at the bottom of the sea, and from this he created the land. Later, he stole the sun, stars, and moon and released them into the sky, thus creating the modern cosmos. So that's the creation story, basically, in a nutshell. But it begins with a flood, but not the flood of Noah's Ark, which when I looked on the net and tried to find if there's comparative work on flood traditions, and you get into some interesting websites. This one is sort of takes the Bible story as the model and then decides which elements are in various cultures. And of course, Tlingit doesn't fit on there. But actually it created a lot of confusion for Tlingit people when the missionaries came and they said, oh, you have a flood story. We have a flood story. And they tried to mesh them together and make one flood story into the other flood story. But they, as David Katzik said in that long interview, he said, but my grandparents never could understand this talk about the rain. It didn't involve rain. It was a big incoming tide and rising waters. And so they couldn't quite get there. And so maybe that's why they didn't make the list. But the Aztecs did, evidently. So anyway, so it was more like this rather than the Noah's Ark version. So this is actually quite a recent paper that I just happened to read preparing for this talk. And this represents kind of the latest thinking on migration from the old world to the new world, basically suggesting from 16,000 years before present, you had these ice-free corridors up and down the coast. It was a very narrow one between what's called the Cordilleran ice sheet and the Laurentian ice sheet. And you had this coastal refugia along the coast of Beringia, which allowed people as early as 20,000 to 17,000 years ago to exist in what is now Southeast Alaska. And one of the things they were trying to look at is once an area becomes ice-free, how long does it take to become a productive ecosystem worthy of supporting people? And it's very, very, very fast. So they're convinced that by 17,000 years ago, people could be living and dwelling there. And the material evidence hasn't quite caught up with that, but the more sites they find, particularly in the karst cave archaeology that they're doing, the older things they're finding. So anyway, that's what happened. And of course, as the ice continued to melt, so this is a picture from about 25,000 years ago at the end of the last glacial maximum, and you can see these refugia are there in green, and then obviously today you have the whole archipelago free, but with all this ice melting and going into the water, the conditions for the flood were ripe, right? And just when the flooding occurred and if it was the same in all areas is still not really definitive, but a lot of it could have occurred around 8,000 years ago with the melting of the major polar ice caps in the region. But it required some adaptation when this all stabilized, and this too is well recorded in the oral history. And so just to give one example, this is, again, Bob spoke of this is one that is maintained by the Dukdane Tan of Hoona, and John Martin, the house leader there, is wearing it, and it's called When Raven Dove Down to the Bottom of the Bull Kelp. And why did he do this? Well, there's a whole story about how he did this to free up the tides, because an old woman of the tides was sitting on the tides, preventing low tide and high tide from happening. So he pricked her with a sea urchin in her backside and caused her to move off the drain, as it were, allowing the tides to move. But then, as John Martin tells it, he said the people were kind of starving on the beach because of all of this flooding and environmental change. There was no stable source of food, and Raven spoke to them and he said, there's actually a lot of food here. Why are you huddled there starving when your table is set? And essentially, I think this is a reference to the stabilization of the tides and the water levels in the area, but also a notion that you had to go a little bit below the intertidal area to get the full potential of the shellfish and invertebrate resources. But in this narrative, Raven speaks to the people about the different kinds of food: the crab, the black cod, the king crab, the gumboots, the sea urchin, the flounders. And then he told them all the kinds of food that they could eat and not eat during different times of year. And so for that lesson, they took this image as a crest, and it became a part of their history. But it's a major adaptation also, and a major response to environmental change and the stabilization, I think, of the tides that's occurring about 5,000 years ago. Okay, so then at the end of this flood, you have this epoch of reorganization. But before we sort of talk about the reorganization, this is just a slide to say that rocks are important in a lot of cultures. I'm going to skip that there. I want to go into one of these stories in detail, and this is one that was recorded actually by Viola Garfield, another great ethnographer, woman ethnographer who was mainly worked in Tsimshian, but she did some work in Tlingit communities. And I got into reading her notebooks, which are at the University of Washington Library, and she did record some of these flood narratives, and this one is particularly detailed. So it's worth reading. So Peter Grant of Cake, which is in central southeast, not far from Sitka, says, my uncle said the tide came in only so far, and then it doesn't go down. So far each time it came up, it came higher, and the people knew it, and they got ready to save their lives. Put things in canoes, and each woman tied spruce root lengths, in southern Tlingit it was cedar bark, together into long rope. Described elsewhere as very thick, 4 to 6 inches in some cases. The tides go down and the canoes are dry, but each time they come up higher to the mountain. And Aina Shah, which is a real mountain in a place called Port Camden, was the mountain they retreated to. And as they were going up there, animals tipped over some of their canoes. Bears tried to get on the canoes. Mice also came up, and at night they were like mosquitoes. Big rock still there on top of the mountain. People tied canoes to this rock. When the water came to the mountain, it did not cover it, and the people were saved. And then the water began to go down slowly. Very many people drowned. Large uprooted trees destroyed canoes and killed people. Few were saved. All were like one family during the flood. The separate tribes really started after the flood. And then a new tribe, a family reduced to one man, moved off and married somewhere else, and then a new tribe was started. When the tides came down, everyone came down to their places, and people could not make fire or get fresh water. Small children died. Finally, the land was dry, and rain gave them fresh water, and the people start to live normally. After this, they went back to all of the old places, and he names them. So this is really one of the more detailed accounts of exactly what was going on and the fact that a lot of people died during this period. But it also points to the fact that they were saved by the mountain, which is Mabel Jack's way of saying that I really like in the film. She says, quoting her father, if it weren't for these mountains, basically, there wouldn't be much people here. That's the way she put it. And so to thank the mountains, some people took them as crests, which is a way of saying thank you. And so this is actually a mountain behind Yangon known as Hood Bay Old Woman, or Sagwash Shankuk. and it's represented here on a tunic or shirt. And this was a flood refuge mountain, which has a stone nest on it, which includes petrified rope from when they tied their rafts or canoes to the mountain during the flood. So it's a different one north of Cape in Angoon, but very similar story represented. Now, a key part of this is that when people came off the mountain, they had to migrate, and many of them migrated into what is now the interior, into Canada. And for some reason, not very many of them wanted to stay there. Okay, you hear things like they missed the seafood, stuff like that. And so they tried to make their way back down. But according to some of the oral history, this took generations before they could do this. And one of the interviews we did with Cyril George, who was talking about the mountaintop cairns, he said, we, his clan, which is a branch of the Deshitan called the Basket Bay Deshitan, we were coming down from Teslin, which is an interior village. The Killer Whale clan saw us. We told them we're going to salt water. We're moving to salt water. Killer Whale says, can we join you? That's where we're from. So I get to tell their story. When we started, the two tribes elected the chief, the Killer Whale tribe, to be the leader of that because they knew that place. So we got down from there and we ran into a big glacier. He's talking about the Stikine River. There's a big river going under that ice, Stikine River. We were stuck. Two old ladies from the Killer Whale tribe volunteered to drift under the ice on small rafts. They were strapped down. When they pushed out, young bucks like him took off over the ice to see if they'll come out downstream. When they came drifting out, they were so happy. These ladies started to sing such a happy song. But the Killer Whale tribe, some of them didn't want to drift under the ice. They went over the hill, came down. And my father-in-law, he says some from the Killer Whale tribe got too chicken to float under the ice and went back to the interior and stayed there. And they're still there today, some of the killer whales. We hit saltwater in Wrangell and spread out along the coast. Okay? And this is consistent with other oral histories of other clans. And it really begins the formation of the modern day clans, these migrations. And so most clans have a migration story, and it includes other clans that they interacted with and eventually intermarried with during that time. Okay, then the final period I'm calling the Epoch of Resilience, which is essentially since the Little Ice Age, so in the last 1,000 years roughly, or even since the climax of the Ice Age, since 1500 or so. And in this era, you have a number of things going on, but one of them is obviously the land has stabilized and the culture is challenged not so much by environmental change, but by social change. But to brace and prepare and respond to this social change, people are drawing inspiration from the flood and how people responded to the flood. So this continues. And one of the things you find to this day is that people wear these ropes. Okay, and remember they talked about in that Peter Grant narrative of the women weaving the ropes. And these ropes are now worn, usually around the head by women and worn as a sash by men, and that's a reminder of the flood and the strength of the ancestors who survived the flood. Okay, and then here's the gratuitous reference to herring, because one of the things that helped people, along with shellfish after the flood, was capitalizing on herring fisheries. And so herring are honored, including in a recent potlatch, because people are not happy with the way they're being managed by the Department of Fish and Game. And people continued to be taken up to visit these these sites, to remind them of the flood story and what messages they should draw from it for today. And in many cases, these were clan leaders in training who were taken to these places, taught the history as a way to prepare them. So Frank White, who also appeared in that video briefly, tells of his grandfather. He wanted me to see it. You know, he says, we're walking down the mountain. We took a risk. The reason I showed you is to see it firsthand. Some people will ask you how long you've been here. So how long ago was the flood? And we've been here, obviously, since then. My uncles, their job was to get me ready when the time comes to lead. So that's how I learned some of my history, you know, where we came from, where we migrated from, and then after the flood, okay? Another one, a younger man who was surprised had been led up to mountains by his grandparents, both down by Petersburg, a place called Thomas Bay, and to some of the ones on southern Admiralty Island, including the Hood Bay Old Woman that I mentioned. And he said they would talk about things that happened during the flood. And they saw the mosquito people. This is a kind of race of smaller people who were also living on Earth at that time. And they were also trying to build shelters to get away from the flood. He refers to them as a kind of gnarly people, mischievous, almost impish, like gremlins. But the first one, the mosquito people built, didn't work. It wasn't high enough, and so many of them were wiped out. But his grandparents took him up the mountain to show where the mosquito people built their shelters, and then where his ancestors built their shelters, their refuges. And he said they talked a little bit about Raven, and this is important. They didn't try to moralize, so to speak. They didn't say it was because of the sinfulness of mankind, like a moral Jeremiad. They talked about being able to survive this, looking at change that was all around them and wondering, can we adapt? And adapt they did. And my grandparents sang a song about the flood. They would be up there with their shakiyat, which is a kind of hat with sea lion whiskers on it that you use for dancing. And they would leave a small offering to all those who had endured the flood and some who had died while the flood was around. Then they left some small gifts, and they would say the names of those that were deceased. Okay, and then here's, as I said, continuing references. So here we see a couple of events from this fall. This is the Resilience in a Time of Change, Indigenous Peoples Day, which talked a lot about the struggles people face in having lost their language and learning to revitalize it, having suffered, or their parents having suffered discrimination in boarding schools and so on. And this is equated to a flood, essentially, a flood of Western culture, as David Katzig puts it in the film, and something that you have to be strong to respond to. And how do you be strong to respond to it? Well, the wisdom is already there. It's in the fact that our ancestors survived the flood. Okay, and that's part of the message that David R. Boxley, who designed this image, is trying to convey. And he's a young person, and he's learning his language, Tsimshian language, teaching form line classes, including to prisoners in the Lemon Creek Correctional Center in Juneau, as part of a program called Haflatsin Community Project, Strength and Resilience Through Arts program. So Haflatsin is something that could be translated as resilience, means strength, internal and external strength, mental and physical strength. And then also at Potlatches, again, you see this is a male version of that flood rope, talking about resilience. And of course, the Ku'ik, the memorial party in Tlingit is something that's very much alive and well, and I think serves as a source of resilience particularly for the clan social structure, because they are done by clans to keep essentially the lineage going and to recognize those who have died. Okay, so how does all this relate to contemporary climate change? Well, a few basic points. One is that oral history frames and non-human culture heroes are marginal to most Anthropocene and climate change narratives, including resilience narratives. Yet many cultures find sources of resilience and resourcefulness and adaptation in such narratives. They can become touchstones of connection to and interpretation of contemporary environmental and social change. I think this is nicely reflected in another ethnography on the Tlingit and southern Tuchoni by Julie Cruikshank, who's reflecting on the fact that glaciers listen. The book is called Do Glaciers Listen? But these changes may also come and feel like floods. And of course, Raven stories are cosmic, but flood stories are also place-based. Every Tlingit community has its flood refuge mountains, suggesting the connection between broad cosmic narratives of mythic time and the origins, development, and ongoing cycles of adaptation, resilience, and transformation of particular groups, which is so nicely represented in this classic adaptation resilience cycle that we find in the work of the Resilience Alliance, if you're familiar with that. And then finally, like Raven, Pan, the Greek god, evokes caprice, vulnerability, and change at interacting scales of impact. And this led a couple of the resilience theorists to term the kind of governance system that we need panarchy, because this is the instability we face in contemporary climate change. And resilience theory also suggests that no system can be understood on a single scale. And I think this is part of the reason why Alpine Cairns speak so well, because they speak at multiple scales. They speak at a social scale, they speak at a temporal scale, they speak at spatial scales, all of responses to environmental change. And then, I don't know why, but for some reason, I thought it important to reflect on John Krakauer's famous, at least among mountaineers, you've heard it, some of you, idea that is it Into Thin Air, that he writes about, I thought in climbing Devil's Thumb, Takunakusha, which is a flood refuge mountain, would fix all that was wrong with my life. In the end, of course, it changed almost nothing, but I came to appreciate that mountains make poor receptacles for dreams. But they're great repositories for wisdom to how to survive environmental change. This is the point I want to make. Krakauer should have spoken to people in Wrangell before he went up Devil's Thumb and learned the real history of that mountain, because if he did, he would see that it was a flood refuge mountain, which has inspired really strong narratives of resilience and identity among people from Stakeen Kwang since the time of the flood. And so it's a repository of identity and resilience amidst change. Cairn speak, manifesting ancestral presence, wisdom, strength, endurance, and adaptation. A couple of final thoughts. David Katzig, if my people gave up when the flood happened, where would I be today? And from Charlie Joseph, that's history. If you're Tlingit, that's proof you've lived here way before time and you were created here. Okay? So these are some reasons why we should hold on to flood stories and think about sacred mountains and refuges and the narratives we have about climate change and the Anthropocene. Thank you.